Lutz could feel his heartbeat hammering sickeningly in his temples, and it seemed as though all the blood in his body was rushing to his brain. Deputy Clarkson violently heaved and then discreetly turned to throw up into the ditch next to the highway. Lutz crouched down on his haunches close to the severed limb and reached into his shirt pocket for a ballpoint pen. He used the pen to peel one of the shreds of flesh away from the wound while turning his head to take another clean breath. It had nearly been destroyed when Lutz suddenly had a terrible flash of his late wife's venison jerky. He battled the impulse to throw up as sour bile rose in his throat. What animal might harm a person in this way? Who would disturb an animal? He was aware of no bear sightings in this region, and all of the wolves had long since been exterminated. Although coyotes occasionally preyed on chickens or ducks, Lutz couldn't think of a single case in which they attacked a young child, much less an adult. Furthermore, they weren't coyote teeth or claw prints. This was done by something with significantly longer teeth. From the forest to his left, there was an abrupt snap. The blood in Lutz's veins froze solid. Clarkson concurred. In an instant, his gun was back at his shoulder, and he took a tentative step into the approaching pitch blackness. Billy Hudson, who was standing next to him, was completely stiff and had deathly white fingers around the shotgun's grip. Another crack in the shadows. If only that one was closer. He swiftly turned the flashlight's beam away from the gory sight on the road and into the woods. It highlighted skeletal pine trees and thorn bushes that were waist height. The pine trees' slender trunks were illuminated in an unsettling way. The trees took on the appearance of rows of ominous spears ready to pierce the unaware travelers with their ladders of shattered branches. The stifling quiet of the woods was odd. Lutz squinted at the shadows while wishing for them to take the form of figures. He concentrated on the light's periphery, where it abruptly faded into a thick, opaque blackness. He believed he could make out forms in the large, foreboding, shadowy areas that seemed to be much darker than the darkness. In the distance, he could just make out a huge figure dancing. However, nothing emerged from the woods charging at them, and after a considerable amount of time, Lutz loosened his position. Lutz turned back to Billy while denying it had been a deer in an unconvincing manner. Now that there was evidence of a death, there was no longer any proof of a crime. Before they could all return home, there was still work to be done. He said, "Did you say there were more bodies?" After a protracted pause, Billy finally said, "Yes, maybe, I'm not sure." "Come and have a look for yourself, please. Let's get this over with, Sheriff," said Clarkson, who appeared perplexed by the response. "I have the fucking creeps in this place." Hearing his deputy express his trepidation somehow gave Lutz more self-assurance. He could feel attentive eyes on them even though the forest was now at his back, but he managed to calm himself down. Billy received his nod of approval as he said, "Let's get this the fuck over with and go home." The guys started pacing the perimeter of the cornfield that surrounded Bud McGuire's house after leaving the lone, sad arm on the side of the road. The maze was thin and ill-looking despite the fact that it should have towered above them at a full height of 16 feet. Lutz found some solace in the fact that the weak stalks of the undernourished crops made it simpler for his maglite beam to permeate the fields. The McGuire home was looming ahead, situated back almost half a mile from the side of the road. The house first appeared to be in much the same condition as when Lutz had been 8 years before. But as they went down the sloppy gravel road, the state of the house started to become more and more obvious. A rust-covered mailbox that was dangerously balanced on its aged wooden pillar sat at the beginning of the route. It was clear that the McGuires had neglected to maintain their communication. He casually questioned how Bud took care of things like plumbing and electricity if bills never arrived at their home. In a previous era, the main home must have been very beautiful. It had a sharp, elegant colonial-style structure with gabled windows and a spacious wraparound porch. A drooping roof and missing shutters, however, covered over the sharp lines. The porch was sagging as well, with a worn-out wicker couch abandoned in one corner. White paint and blue trim that must have once been cheery were now gray and coming off the wood in wide stripes. Like a once proud old horse that lacked the stamina to raise its head high in the traces, the entire home had an aura of fatigue. One bent hinge was keeping the front door open. Lutz signaled for the guys to stay position as they drew near by holding up one hand that was tightly fisted. His initial anxiety had subsided, replaced with the oddly detached sense he often experienced when approaching a murder scene that was certain to be upsetting. Typically, it was a teenager who drank excessively and wrapped his automobile around a tree, or perhaps a drunken trucker who chose to bury his wife after getting home. Lutz was accustomed to the violence that males are prone to after serving for 30 years in the sheriff's office. However, it wasn't a guy who tore off that child's arm. Lutz flashed his spotlight on the house's damaged door as if to prove this horrifying theory. 4 parallel gouges ran from the top of the door frame to the bottom corner in one continuous, uninterrupted arc, cutting so deeply into the wood that the door was almost split into pieces. The doorknob was made of aluminum, but it was bent out of shape and dangled pointlessly to one side. There was just more darkness beyond the door. Chapter 4. Up until this time, Deputy Clarkson had been a tremendous sport, but when faced with the idea of entering this home, he reacted negatively. "No offense, Sheriff, but fuck this," he said as he let go of his death grip and lowered his weapon to his side. "I'm not entering the place. Let's return to the car and make the call." "Who do I call, Henry?" Lutz said indifferently. "The only thing the state troopers can do is issue fines to visitors. When there is a violent death, the town police contact us. So who do we actually need to call? Control of animals? Then let's go back to the car and come back in the goddamn daylight." Clarkson growled between tight teeth as he scowled back at him. Lutz thought Clarkson was the one who had been making the most sense throughout the evening. Even if he secretly agreed with his deputy's plan to leave the McGuire residence, they were already there, and a task awaited them. "Henry, hurry up. Billy has been there. Now we can't allow the youngster expose us," Lutz stated with an artificially humorous tone that sounded fake to him. He groaned, ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair and over his brow before trying again. "Yes, this is terrible, does not alter the truth. We must ascertain what, if anything, took place here tonight. So let's simply pack up and finish the job, okay?" Although it wasn't much of a pep talk, it appeared to work. Billy scuffed his boots against the brown grass around the McGuire's front porch and shrugged heavily. After briefly closing his eyes as though in a quiet prayer, Clarkson reshouldered his gun and nodded at Lutz. He said matter-of-factly, "I'm taking a long weekend. I'm going to drive my wife to Iowa City. We'll visit Red Lobster." He muttered to himself about his forthcoming weekend as brushing by Lutz and ascending the creaky steps to the porch. "It's Crab Fest. The entire week may be off limits." Lutz gave his subordinate a mental commitment. He then followed the 2 guys through the door and inside Bud McGuire's house while pulling his handgun out of its holster and deactivating the safety. As the guys entered the McGuire home, a great hush descended about them. The thick layer of dust covering the floor masked the officer's heavy boots' footfall. The wallpaper in the entryway was the color of old feces in the flashlight's beam, though it had once been a cheerful striped yellow that had been twisted by water damage. The men were facing a lengthy hallway with doors on either side. Lutz could see the typical farmhouse mudroom on one side, replete with racks of rubber Wellington boots and bulky parkas. The jackets were moth-eaten and reeked of dampness, while the wellies were dull and cracked from lack of use. The kitchen was presumably farther within the home behind a locked door, a room with delicate furnishings and many porcelain figures, which Lutz's wife would have called a parlor if she had been living, located on the left side of the hallway. The first indication of human activity was located here. The delicate tables were destroyed, and the rose-patterned love seat was positioned at a sharp angle to a moth-eaten carpeting, as if someone had suddenly and violently moved the sofa. The floor was covered with fragments of a broken water jug. Strangely enough, a heavy coating of dust managed to soften even this horrific image. The only indication that a human had been inside the house up until that point were the tracks Billy's large work boots had made in the hallway. The McGuires were where? Lutz made continuous pivots while illuminating every nook and cranny with his powerful floodlight. He pushed all of his senses to the limit to see whether there was still a threat in this house. His senses were electrified. His senses told him that this was a typical house, although one that had been horribly neglected. He said, "Billy," beneath his breath, "why on earth did you ever enter this room?" In a low reply, Billy continued, "Like I said, sir, I thought perhaps someone was in difficulty. However, after I arrived, it seemed as though I had to keep moving forward. I had to investigate on my own." Lutz recognized he shared the sensation. The frantic instinct to go back to the car was stifled by grim resolve. He had to figure out what in the world had occurred.